Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And just before I dive into the substance of what will be, I have no doubt, of great interest to all those in this place when it comes to the SDTC scandal that has continued to paralyze this place, and the Liberal government's, and specifically that Prime Minister's, refusal to simply release the documents. There's just a couple of quick things that I would like to note, and one is very personal. You know, I often hear that from when I get home on the weekends and I see, in particular, my grandmas. I know my one grandma, she texts me, and my other grandma, I just see her, whether it's at church on Sunday or when I go to visit her. They often say, will compliment me on my speeches and whatnot. So sometimes I think we wonder if anybody is actually watching these proceedings. Well, I know that my grandma, both my grandmas Linda and my grandmas Nora are. So just a shout out to both Grandma Linda and Grandma Nora, two fine women, and my grandfathers who have passed on, but just the incredible legacy they have there. So I love you, Grandma, and I love you, Grandma. That's a shout out to you because there's a good chance that you're watching here. So thank you for that latitude, Mr. Speaker. Here we are back debating the Green Slush Fund, where we have an instance of nearly $400 million of taxpayers' money. And let me pause there, because I think there's an important distinction that I'd like to elaborate on a little bit. We have an instance where there's this $400 million that has been misallocated, wrongly allocated, allocated to organizations, companies, et cetera. That it's been called into question, close to $400 million. But what is important is not just the dollar amount. Don't get me wrong, it's a huge number. But what is key in understanding, and why it is such a significant thing for us to get answers and for us to get the true clarity when it comes to what happened here, is because that is $400 million not of the government's money. Not of the government's money. The government doesn't have money in and of itself, but rather it has money that it derives from taxes. And it's the money that it derives from taxes, Mr. Speaker, that it then spends. And I think that often that is forgotten about in this place. And as parliamentarians from all parties, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that we need to take seriously that it is not government's money to spend, but rather it is us being stewards of the dollars that are paid in taxes by Canadians. And I think that that fundamental premise is so often forgotten, and we have seen time and time again over these last 9 years under the NDP Liberals, where they have forgotten where the money comes from. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the result of that is an utter disregard that leads to scandals like which we are seeing today, where you have an unbelievable amount of money, close to $400 million being misallocated, allocated where there was conflicts of interest, etc. And then I'll get into the privilege side of that here in just a moment. But Mr. Speaker, what is absolutely key is that the amount of money that this relates to is truly astonishing. And when in comparison, most Canadians that will be watching, whether it's my grandmas that I referenced earlier, or whether I know it is so many others that are wondering, well, what's the deal with this $400 million? It is said, and when economists do evaluations when it comes to the dollars in an economy, quite often the most easily understood dollars, and in terms of the amounts, is not the numbers and figures that parliamentarians quite often throw around, or when an announcement has, millions or billions of dollars associated to it, Mr. Speaker. But when it really comes down to it, you have an average Canadian family, the biggest the biggest expense that they will make is the purchase of their home. Now, while we have seen a doubling of house prices over the last decade under these NDP Liberals, and we have seen some real challenges in terms of Canadians being able to afford the basics, and the carbon tax impact on all of these things, and the inflationary effect it has across our economy, and everything related to that, the average Canadian spends less than $1 million on a home. Less than $1 million. So you have an example where the largest purchase that the average Canadian family ever makes is 1/400th of the dollars, tax dollars, that have been abused when it comes to this green slush fund. That is truly astonishing, the scale and the impact. You can break that down further. A common investment within most households is that of a vehicle. Now, I know that it's been called into question. The NDP leader certainly drives, I didn't even know Maseratis were made SUVs, but that's certainly been publicized here as of late as the choice vehicle of the leader of the fourth party in this place. And when I looked at the price, it was, that was quite a, for somebody who claims to be from the middle class, that is quite a claim when you drive that type of vehicle. But Mr. Speaker, you have the average vehicle. When it comes to what Canadians spend, kind of the average between the average between many Canadians buying used vehicles versus those who buy new, and you have before you what is an average price of a vehicle that often equates to about $40,000. So that's average across it, from the very expensive Maseratis, like the leader of the fourth party drives, or Canadians that are just starting out, whether that's a 16-year-old that is buying their first vehicle for several $1,000s. You have about this average of about $40K. And you think about the scale of $400 million versus $40,000. And it puts into context, and the reason why, Mr. Speaker, I am flagging this and providing that context is because it is truly astonishing the scale of which this scandal is, the dollars, those hard-earned dollars that taxpayers earned, paid to the government through taxes, and we saw misallocated, misappropriated, and through a scandal-ridden process, we have this abuse. And Mr. Speaker, it bears, I would suggest, repeating that because of the failures that have been exposed, and the former Minister of Industry that took an organization that under the previous Harper government and under the scandal-plagued Martin and Chrétien governments before was operating fairly well, had a high efficiency rate, a good return on investment, and certainly didn't have the types of scandals that we're seeing today. So you had three successive governments that under their leadership saw this organization do its job, which is invest in sustainable technologies, ensure that there is including at times where there might be a business case but a little bit higher risk, so going with partnerships in terms of private lending and whatnot, and you saw a good return on taxpayers' investment, those hard-earned dollars that the government takes that could see leveraged for economic development. Yet, it was in 2018 when the former minister, Navdeep Bains, fired Harper's board and installed Liberal insiders where the problems began to brew. And we have seen over the last 5 or 6 years how the result is that this $400 million that have been called into question. It truly is astonishing, Mr. Speaker, the scale to which the scandal we have before us. And the fact that now we have, I believe this is week 6, maybe going into week 7, where Parliament has been seized with this issue, paralyzed by this scandal that has shook the very foundations of our democratic infrastructure, which is calling into question for so many Canadians about whether or not they can trust government. And Mr. Speaker, I talk often about trust in this place, because trust is a key element of what we do here. It's the idea of the social contract. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to a class this morning, and it was a very interesting a discussion. I always appreciate it. It was a grade 9 class from the Prairie Christian Academy in Three Hills, Alberta. Great group of kids, great questions, very, very engaging conversation. It truly was a great opportunity to talk about how to get involved in government, citizenship, and the responsibility of that, and an incredible conversation. But one of the things that we talked about was the idea of the social contract. And although that's often a topic of conversation that happens in university philosophy classes, the reason why I bring up the idea of the social contract is it is this back and forth, this tension that exists, that citizens have a responsibility in order to have freedom. There's that back, there's a tension there that exists. We have to be able to trust government for government to be able to function appropriately in our country. And I think that where we see the social contract being called into question is after 9 years of these Liberals. We are seeing there's been an erosion of trust that's taken place. And the erosion of trust that has taken place is forcing many Canadians across our country to lose trust not only in the person who's in charge, and the current Prime Minister and those in the Liberal Party and the NDP that continue to prop them up, but they are losing trust in the very foundational institutions of our democracy. Those institutions that have persisted in the case of Canada for 157 years, and then I know responsible government coming several decades before that and different types of administrations prior to that point in time. But our history of our democratic system dating back more than 800 years to the United Kingdom, where in the first few sentences of the British North America Act, now known as the Constitution Act of 1867, it talks about being in similar form to that of the Parliament of the United Kingdom in this Westminster system. We are seeing this mismanagement call into question the trust that Canadians should be able to have in their institutions. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you today that of all the things that we debate, this truly is one of such significance because it's the keystone on which we can continue to ensure that we have a strong and functioning democracy. We have to be able to trust that our government works. Now, let me unpack that for just a moment. We need to ensure that it is not simply trust in an individual, because no government is an individual. But what is the reality here, Mr. Speaker, is that we have a trust eroding of the institution in and of itself. Whereas we used to be able to say we might not like the guy or gal in charge, but we could respect the office. Mr. Speaker, it has come to the point where truly it is, there are so many instances where people are losing trust in the institutions themselves. And I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that that is something that should seize each and every one of us as parliamentarians. So, Mr. Speaker, we have the basic premise of trust in our institutions that underlies the debate which we are having. So now when it comes to the very basics, which is that we have to release the documents. Simple, 3 words, release the documents, right? It's not that hard. Release the documents. Here we have Parliament, which has constitutionally unfettered access and ability to demand for documents. In fact, in the constitutional framework, which was written long before the advent of computers, we have the ability for government to demand any document that exists in Canada, period. Any Parliament can demand that. It is within its rights to demand any document. And over the last 9 years, we have seen something that I'd like to unpack a little bit here. That not only is it a refusal of the government to release the documents in relation to this $400 million in taxpayers' money that has been misallocated, allocated where there was conflicts of interest, etc. But, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing how in the midst of this, we are truly, it's truly the continuation of a pattern. You see, and this pattern is what I would suggest can be summed up by a phrase that these Liberals, under that Prime Minister, have normalized constitutional crises. And I say that not flippantly, but with all seriousness, because time and time again, we see how they have utter disregard for the Constitution. Now, when most Canadians think of the Constitution, they think of the thing that is often on the walls of classrooms, and that's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that is an important aspect of our Constitution. which has Pierre Elliott Trudeau's signature at the bottom of it, although the history of that, for those who might be watching, you look at the history and what was eventually adopted is certainly different than what Pierre Elliott Trudeau envisioned, but he's certainly happy to take credit for it. But we have that part of our Constitution, as well as a host of other constitutional documents, one of which I referenced earlier, the British North American Act, or the Constitution Act of 1867. We have a host of constitutional documents dating back from the foundation of this country all the way to where we are today, where there was a minor constitutional amendment just a number of years ago when it came to the number of MPs that would be representing each province in this place. So you have this series of documents, and when it comes to constitutional law, it's a series of written and unwritten laws. That defines the Westminster system. So we have before us that this government has such utter disregard for constitutional convention, for the role that the 800+ years of constitutional history that has built this Westminster system. They have utter disregard, Mr. Speaker, for the things that have allowed us to function as a free and open democracy. Not without its challenges, but certainly these Liberals are putting our institutions at risk, the normalizing of constitutional crises. And I would highlight one that comes to mind whenever, and I hear from constituents often about this, is the Winnipeg Lab scandal, where you had documents that Parliament demanded. It was a minority Parliament, and it certainly seems that the 2021 election, despite the Prime Minister promising that he wouldn't call it and then called it anyways, and certainly seemed to leverage much of the fear that Canadians had around the COVID pandemic, that certainly seems to be a big part of it. But Mr. Speaker, what happened during that summer was absolutely astounding. You had the government take Parliament, specifically the Speaker, to court over a document's request, a constitutional crisis. Unbelievable and unacceptable. You had the election that took place. Was that the reason why they called the election? Was there something that was so revealing that would have brought down that Prime Minister and that government, that would have exposed them? I don't know. But Mr. Speaker, what is very, very clear is that they will stop at nothing, including ripping up the Constitution to try and cover up their scandals. And then we have had time and time again, we had in 2020, those Liberals proposed to give themselves unlimited spending and taxation power. Mr. Speaker, just to give some context to that, that would have torn up 800 years of tradition that demands responsible government, including money only being spent with permission of the House and taxes only to be levied by Parliament. You see, we have before us what has been an astounding a series of events that lead us to the privileged debate that we are having today. The Liberals could end this immediately. They could. They simply have to release the documents. And in doing so, would put to rest the crises that they have brought forward that have not only kept them from being able to accomplish their agenda, but have caused an erosion of trust in the very institutions of this place. And I would conclude, Mr. Speaker, my remarks by referencing some of the extraordinary Canadians to whom we work for. I had the opportunity to meet with the constituents, Fire Chief Mole from Hanna, Alberta, and a couple of his colleagues, one from Redwater and the other from Grande Prairie, small town, small city fire chiefs. And it was a good conversation. They came and saw a question period, and what was encouraging in the midst of that is to see Canadians at work. In this case, small town emergency services personnel that are ready to do the work when called upon. So I compliment them, and I know there's advocacy that is taking place on the Hill this week, and I wish them the best in that. I appreciate the opportunity to have met them earlier. But Mr. Speaker, when it comes down to it, we need to take seriously our responsibility as parliamentarians. We need to ensure that we are responding to the call. And when it comes to the very crux of the issue here, we have to restore trust in our institutions, Mr. Speaker, and that can start by the Liberals releasing the documents so we can get back to work.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Despite 2.5 months of this, no one's talking about this, Mr. Speaker. Nobody cares about this issue. If this member keeps talking, and Conservatives have now put up over 200 people on this issue, Canadians are not talking about this. What they are talking about, Mr. Speaker, what they're talking about on the news tonight is that 5 people within Patrick Brown's campaign have now come forward to say that the member from Calgary Nose Hill knew exactly that Indian diplomats were affecting Patrick Brown's campaign. She even had a conference call, according to what's being reported, where she brought it up on a conference call. Does this member not agree that the member from Calgary Nose Hill should be going to the Public Safety Committee and answering about what she knows when it comes to foreign interference in the Patrick Brown leadership campaign?
Just a reminder to honourable members, I know one of our speakers did rule that we want to try to keep the questions and the comments as close to the topic at hand as possible. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, the leader of the official opposition won the leadership of our party by the largest margin of any major national leadership campaign in Canadian history, Mr. Speaker. I think the evidence speaks for himself and is commanding a massive amount of support. And quite frankly, unlike it seems many Liberals, we actually like our leader and the work that he's doing and the message that he's offering to Canadians. And I would suggest that Canadians are increasingly on our page. Certainly, I'm hearing increasingly from Canadians from coast to coast to coast, Mr. Speaker, that are ready for change because they're sick and tired of the corruption, they're sick and tired of the waste, and they're sick and tired of those Liberals dividing Canadians for political gain. But Mr. Speaker, I would like to reference something that member said. He said Canadians don't care about this. Well, 400 million reasons would suggest otherwise, and the fact that member and those Liberals supported by the NDP would so flippantly not care about $400 million in misallocated, misappropriated tax dollars, that is an absolute shame, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Rosemont La Petite Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech. We are living through difficult times. The American president-elect, who will soon be president, has made some serious threats to Canadian jobs and sectors, and he says that we are not taking proper care of our borders. Would my colleague agree with me that this is partly because of Stephen Harper's government? He cut 1,100 border services agent jobs. Now, today, we're being criticized for having a border that is like a colander.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting, a member of my staff just texted me and said, I've actually received thousands of emails about the green slush fund. So to the member from Kingston and the Islands, he's simply out to lunch. But when it comes to the issue of our borders, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, we need to take this seriously. But after 9 years, including for 5 of those years where this government has been propped up by the fourth party in the corner over there, the fact that crime was on its way down when Stephen Harper left office and the Prime Minister took over. I withdraw and reference the Prime Minister when he took over. The fact that illegal border crossings were down. The fact that smuggling was on its way down. Mr. Speaker, by almost every objective measure, life in Canada was getting better, despite at that point in time where there was much global economic uncertainty. Yet Canada was well positioned. And then those Liberals and that Prime Minister took over, and for the last 5 years have been supported by that fourth party, the NDP. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the consequences of that each and every day, and now it is putting our country's economic future at risk. I understand why the President of the United States wants to stand up for American jobs, but Mr. Speaker, why does this Canadian Prime Minister want to help that American President?
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. The honourable for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I listened to my colleague's speech and he was bang on. This is about our parliamentary democracy and our privileges. I'm going to be speaking next, and it's going to be talking about censorship and how this government has really ramped that up. But I want to ask him about these repeated crises, because he talked about, you know, the sponsorship scandal, the border crisis, and we could go on and on. But I wonder if he thinks that the Liberals are actually normalizing these constitutional crises, because it seems it's a means for them to grab more power. We saw it, you know, during COVID, where they were going after people's bank accounts. You know, they were stopping people from traveling. It just seems that they want to normalize these crises as a power grab. Could he comment on that, please?
Honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that Liberal Prime Minister seems to want to be like his dad when it comes to doing things that are truly unprecedented, and that includes the invocation of the Emergencies Act. First Prime Minister in history to do so. The previous version of that, the War Measures Act, outside of wartime, the only Prime Minister to have invoked it was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what it is about these Liberals, but more in particular, I think the left in general. They are so desperate and hungry for power that they would trod over the Constitution. In the case of our country, they would trod over the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including that has Pierre Elliott Trudeau's, that Prime Minister's father's signature on it. They would trod over it to fulfill their political objectives. But, Mr. Speaker, what we have before us is a normalization of constitutional crises that has taken place. It seems like every which way you look, these Liberals are trotting over the very institutions that were built up over, in the case of our country, 157 years to serve Canadians. These Liberals are trying to turn them into servants of themselves. Mr. Speaker, that's wrong. That needs to be rejected outright, and Conservatives will fix what that Prime Minister and those Liberals have broke.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the current context, it's interesting to think about as DTC. It's also interesting to think about the next president of the US. We need to think about how Canada and Quebec will be able to be different to Americans. We are interdependent. We have to be able to confront together China, for example. So I'd like to hear how important this kind of fund would be to help SMEs, to protect our SMEs so they can invest in the future. That's how we will be more competitive compared to the States, compared to China. We need this kind of fund. Yes, we have to study if the funds are misused and if there's fraud, but does he agree with this kind of fund, fundamentally speaking, so that investments can be made well in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think the evidence speaks for itself. This fund was performing with exemplary ratings, with great integrity, prior to that Prime Minister and the former Industry Minister, Navdeep Bains, going in, firing all of Stephen Harper's appointments and appointing their own, which have led to this incredible level of mismanagement, incompetence, conflicts of interest, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the member from the Bloc raises an interesting point, and that is the idea of Canada's place in the world. We have seen under that Liberal Prime Minister and that Liberal government propped up by the fourth party, the NDP in the corner over there, we have seen an erosion of Canada's reputation internationally. And I found it interesting in question period today, actually, Mr. Speaker. One of the ministers stood up and listed off what they call their accomplishments. And I kept thinking to myself, is he listing his accomplishments or that government's failures? Because every single one of those things, Mr. Speaker, it certainly was not in the best interest of the country, the results, and I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, as a result, Canada is weaker today in its standing in the world, let alone all the challenges we face domestically, but are weaker in our standing in the world today than it was when that Prime Minister took over. It's time for Conservatives to come in and fix what that Prime Minister broke.
Very quick question and answer. The honourable member for St. John Rothsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And actually, talking about a party being desperate for power, I mean, this party opposite has tried to have government for 15, 19, and 21. The member opposite is a straight shooter. I respect him for that. But, Mr. Speaker, here's my question to him. There's clearly something going on with respect to the fact that his leader will not get a security clearance, number one. Two, what is up with the foreign meddling in the leadership contest? The member opposite is a straight shooter. I want a straight answer as to why his leader will not get his security clearance. Canadians want to know. Thank you.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
To that member from St. John's, I would simply say it is time for that Prime Minister to do what he is legally allowed to do under the Official Secrets Act, and it is release the names. In fact, there are very clear provisions, Mr. Speaker, that allow that Prime Minister to, in the public interest, release the names. He refuses to do it, and the question I think many Canadians have is, what does he have to hide?